Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a really focused, highly technical look at how to build and secure Model Context Protocol servers. Okay, let's dive right into this. MCP architecture is absolutely revolutionizing how AI agents interact with external systems, right? But it also introduces a radically new paradigm of risk. So today, we're going to build a comprehensive, structural blueprint for a fortress, a highly secure MCP server environment.
Because really, this is the million-dollar question. How do you secure an AI's dynamic bridge to your private data? We really need to frame the high stakes right up front here. MCP servers, they aren't your standard run-of-the-mill web APIs, not even close. They're highly sensitive, dynamic bridges that operate with delegated user permissions, and they can chain multiple tool calls together totally autonomously. Because of this, if an MCP server is compromised, the blast radius isn't just, a single leaked record. It's the potential manipulation of your AI assistant, the theft of sensitive information, and even the full compromise of connected downstream backend systems. The stakes are just literally massive.
To build our fortress, here's the game plan for this explainer. First, we'll map out the threat landscape. Then, we'll build our 4 rings of defense, starting with architecture and tools, moving to data and prompt firewalls, checking identity and access, and finally, deployment and vigilance. Let's get to it.
All right, part 1, the threat landscape and the unique AI-oriented risks we're up against.
You'll notice a really stark contrast between traditional API risks and these new, dynamic AI threats. Take tool poisoning, for example. This is where an adversary actually crafts malicious inputs right into a tool's metadata or prompt, kind of like hiding instructions in a seemingly harmless tool description, which tricks the AI into exfiltrating data. Or consider dynamic tool instability, otherwise known as a rug pull. Since tools are loaded dynamically, a previously trusted tool definition can literally be swapped out in real time for a malicious one, completely bypassing your initial security checks. You combine that with excessive permissions or credential leakage, you've got a recipe for an absolute disaster.
Looking at this from a macro level, when you've got delegated permissions and shared contexts in the mix, insufficient isolation quickly becomes your absolute biggest vulnerability. Think about it. MCP servers often manage multiple concurrent sessions. If you aren't enforcing strict protocol-level state separation, you're risking cross-tenant data leakage. That means one user's AI could accidentally access another user's private context. Yikes. Furthermore, if you lack compute isolation, like proper sandboxing, a malicious tenant could exhaust shared resources, or even worse, peer into the memory of other processes.
Okay, moving to ring 1 of our defense, architecture and tools, building the foundation.
So the very first architectural decision you have to make is how your MCP server actually communicates. For local connections, you should strongly prefer STDIO or Unix sockets. If you absolutely must use local HTTP, bind it strictly to the loopback address 127.0.0.0.1 and run those processes in isolated sandboxed subprocesses. Now, for remote connections, the rules change, but they're equally strict. You must enforce TLS 1.2 or higher for all traffic, no exceptions. And you've got to strictly validate every single JSON RPC message against your MCP schema, immediately rejecting anything that looks even slightly malformed.
And especially in a multi-tenant environments, your cleanup routines have to be deterministic and instantaneous. It's totally non-negotiable. The exact millisecond an MCP session terminates, times out, or disconnects, your system has to kick off those cleanup routines. We're talking about instantly flushing and destroying all associated file handles, temporary storage, in-memory contexts, and cache tokens. You have to scrub it clean to prevent any residual data exposure.
Now remember those dynamic rug pull attacks we talked about a minute ago? To prevent those, you can't just let any random tool connect. You need a formal, rigorous tool onboarding workflow. It usually breaks down into 4 steps: static code scanning, dynamic testing, dependency scanning, and finally a manual security review. On top of that, you need cryptographic manifests. Basically, every tool must have a signed manifest verifying its description and hash right at load time. This is how you guarantee that a tool's advertised behavior perfectly matches what it's actually doing at runtime.
Let's move to ring 2, data and prompt firewalls, controlling the flow.
Look, treat all data as untrusted is a golden rule in cybersecurity generally, but it is doubly true for MCP servers. You have to define and rigorously enforce JSON schemas for every single input coming from the model and every single output going back to it. This requires strict sanitization. You absolutely must filter out and strip escape sequences that could open the door to classic code injection attacks, things like cross-site scripting or remote code execution.
But you might be wondering, how do you defend against prompt injection? Well, you implement these 4 prompt defenses.
First, favor structured JSON tool calls instead of just letting the model generate free-form text commands. Second, implement human-in-the-loop or HITL checkpoints. For high-risk actions, say deleting data or executing major system changes, pause the system and require an explicit human confirmation. Third, use a separate LLM acting as a judge to evaluate if an action violates policy. And finally, compartmentalize your context. One task equals one session. When a task changes, reset the session. This stops hidden malicious instructions from persisting in the conversation history and hijacking the next step.
All right, on to ring 3, identity and access, the checkpoint.
To really grasp access controls here, we have to talk about the confused deputy risk. This is a massive, massive vulnerability. It's essentially an attack where someone tricks your MCC server into misusing a user's elevated privileges to execute unauthorized actions against your back-end APIs. If your identity management is sloppy here, the MCC bridge itself basically becomes a weapon pointed directly at your own infrastructure.
So, how do we defeat the confused deputy? Simple. You prohibit token pass-through. You must never, ever forward client tokens directly to downstream APIs. Instead, explicitly enforce OAuth 2.1 or OIDC protocols using proper token delegation. What you do is issue new, short-lived, narrowly scoped credentials specifically for the server's non-human identity. This keeps your audit trail perfectly clean and ensures the server can only act within very strictly intended boundaries.
Getting this right requires a fundamental shift in mindset. Treat sessions as state, not identity. A session ID alone is dangerously insufficient for authorization. Every single request, every queue entry has to be tied to a dynamically validated OAuth token. That means you are rechecking authorization signatures, you're checking audiences, and you're checking expiry on every single call before any tool is allowed to execute. And that brings us to our final layer, ring 4, deployment and vigilance, maintaining the fortress.
Now we're zooming out to the macro level. Your deployment infrastructure itself must be hardened. Structurally, this means deploying your MCP server in minimal, non-root containers. You've got to drop all unnecessary Linux capabilities just to shrink that residual attack surface down as much as possible. And you want to place the server in a heavily restricted network segment using strict Kubernetes network policies to block literally all inbound and outbound traffic except exactly what is explicitly required.
Alongside that physical infrastructure, you absolutely need these deployment imperatives. Secrets? They must reside in middleware vaults that are completely inaccessible to the LLM. Do not ever store them in plain text or environment variables. You also need to integrate security gates directly into your CI/CD pipelines, so builds automatically fail if vulnerabilities are detected. And crucially, this one gets overlooked a lot. Ensure safe error handling. Never return stack traces, file system paths, or tool internal logic back to the model or the client. Doing that essentially just hands attackers a free treasure map to your backend.
Ultimately, if you build a fortress, you need guards on duty at all times, right? For us, this means immutable audit logs that record every single tool invocation, though, of course, with sensitive data completely redacted. You also need continuous audits of your non-human identity, or NHI, permissions. And you've got to maintain constant supply chain vigilance. This means running automated SAST and SCA tools to scan your dependencies and monitoring vulnerability databases day in and day out. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. As you look at the architecture of your current or future MCP servers, ask yourself, are your AI agents operating on a foundation of implicit trust, just sort of hoping that dynamic tools will behave? Or are they operating on a foundation of cryptographic proof, strict isolation, and continuous validation? Because the difference between the two is literally the difference between an open door and a secure fortress. Take these principles back to your engineering teams today.